This move immediately seizes central space and opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, initiating common opening strategies to develop pieces and control key squares. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a highly dynamic and complex opening where black immediately challenges white's central pawn control and aims for an unbalanced game. This move develops the knight towards the center, prepares for kingside castling, and supports the pawn on e4, establishing a solid foundation for white's development in the Sicilian defense. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn on e4 and opens a diagonal for the queen, often leading to the French defense or a variation of the Sicilian. This move decisively challenges black's pawn center, aiming to open lines and exploit black's potentially underdeveloped kingside in the classical Sicilian structure. This capture initiates the main line of the Alpine Sicilian, immediately challenging white's central pawn presence and opening the c-file for potential future activity. This move reclaims the pawn in the center and develops a knight to a strong central square, typical of the main lines of the open Sicilian defense. This developing move aims to challenge white's central pawn and develop a piece, entering a typical variation of the Taimanov Sicilian where black seeks active piece play and often a queenside initiative. This move continues white's rapid development, reinforcing the central knight and preparing to castle, while also maintaining pressure on black's d-pawn after its capture. This move transitions from a common open Sicilian into a more positional variation, often leading to the classical variation or variations within the Khan and Taimanov systems, aiming to control central squares and develop pieces harmoniously. This move prepares to castle kingside while also supporting the e4 pawn and developing a piece towards the center. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle and solidifying the pawn chain. Castling kingside is a standard and prudent move, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action on the open or semi-open files. This move completes the development of black's kingside and secures the king, a standard and prudent maneuver in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move initiates a pawn chain with f4, aiming to gain space on the kingside and prepare for potential central pawn advances or an attack against black's king. This move reinforces the center and prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority, fitting into a common setup within the classical Sicilian. This move prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure and supports a potential pawn push with e5. This move prepares to challenge white's central pawn control with b5, potentially opening lines for black's queenside pieces. The queen's redeployment to e1 supports the advance of the f-pawn and prepares for potential kingside play, while also clearing the d1 square for a bishop or rook. This move exchanges knights, simplifying the position and preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority on the queenside. After black plays b5, this bishop exchange aims to simplify the position and secure white's central pawn majority on the kingside while preventing black from developing an easy queenside counterplay. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion typical of many Sicilian structures, aiming to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn. This move prepares to counter black's queenside expansion by preventing b4 and offering a safe square on a2 for the queen if it needs to retreat. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing white's kingside and preparing to support further queenside expansion with b4. The queen moves to g3, preparing to support the f4-f5 pawn push and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the d6 pawn. This move activates the rook onto the semi-open c-file, preparing to challenge white's central control and potentially create pressure along that line. This move safely tucks the king away from the open c-file and potential discovered attacks, while also preparing for a kingside pawn advance or a maneuver of the king to a safer square. This move aims to prepare for a kingside fianchetto, potentially creating a strong defensive barrier or future attacking potential along the dark squares. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the d3 diagonal, potentially preparing to pressure black's kingside or support a central pawn advance. This move initiates an aggressive knight maneuver aiming to exploit the g2 square, potentially exchanging for white's light-squared bishop and opening lines towards the white king. This move centralizes the queen, prepares to reinforce the e4 pawn and potentially support a kingside attack by the knight while keeping an eye on the kingside. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a queenside expansion or reinforcing the central tension. This move reroutes the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating a potential queenside expansion by black and reinforcing the kingside. This move sacrifices a knight to open lines for attack, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and weak squares around it. Black's knight capture on f4 wins a pawn, but white's recapture with the queen directly attacks black's weakened kingside and opens lines for white's pieces. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially gain an outpost for the knight while opening lines for black's pieces. The queen repositions to g3 to defend the e5 pawn and potentially support an attack on the kingside. This capture on d4 opens the e-file for white's rook and creates an isolated pawn for black, potentially becoming a target for white's pieces. This move of bg4 aims to exchange white's bishop for black's knight, simplifying the position and preventing black's pawn advances on the queenside. This move reactivates the queen to potentially support an advance on the kingside or to assist in the defense of the d4 pawn, which is now under threat. This move exchanges a powerful bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and potentially leading to an endgame where black's pawns on the queenside become more prominent. This move sacrifices the pawn on c3 to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines, aiming to exploit the resulting weaknesses in white's kingside defense. This exchange simplifies the position by removing white's active bishop, aiming to improve black's pawn structure and gain space on the queenside. This move captures the pawn, creating an immediate structural imbalance by removing white's c-pawn and opening the c-file for black's rook, while white's bishop on b7 is now vulnerable. This move secures the b2 pawn, preventing black from exploiting its advanced position and allowing white to consolidate material and pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn but allows white to consolidate their material advantage by establishing a protected passed pawn on the b-file after recapturing. This move aims to contest the d-file, which has opened up after the exchange of pieces, and offers potential counterplay by attacking black's weak b2 pawn and putting pressure on the queenside. The move 24, qc6 aims to reactivate the queen, exert pressure on the d4 pawn, and potentially prepare for future piece activity on the c-file, while also defending the weak b2 pawn. This recapture of the pawn on b2 opens the b-file for the rook, creating immediate pressure on black's queen and potential threats against the queenside pawns. This move initiates a central pawn break aiming to destabilize white's pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces. The rook's redeployment to b4 aims to contest the b file, potentially pressure black's queenside pawns, and prepare for central pawn advances, exploiting white's space advantage. This move strategically repositions the rook to the open e file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially create counterplay against white's king or weaken the d4 pawn. This move aims to break open the center and create more dynamic play, challenging black's pawn structure while potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This move aims to challenge white's newly created open c file and potentially activate the rook to a more central file, while also preparing for potential exchanges to ease black's cramped position. This move, cxb5, initiates a pawn break to open lines for white's rooks and attack black's vulnerable queenside pawn structure. This move recaptures the pawn and opens the a file, which will become crucial for rook activity and potentially creating a passed pawn in the endgame. This move activates the rook to the open d file, increasing its influence and preparing to pressure black's weak pawn structure. This move is a concession of the central pawn majority, and black must now consider how to defend the now weakened kingside and potentially activate their pieces on the queenside. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to contest the central open file and potentially launch an attack on the enemy king or exploit weaknesses in the pawn structure. This move uncovers the knight's diagonal, preparing to contest the central files and defend the weakened kingside pawn structure. Capturing the pawn on b5 initiates an exchange that simplifies the position and aims to exploit white's initiative on the queenside after the rook sacrifice. Trading queens simplifies the position, forcing black to defend their isolated d-pawn and navigate a potentially weak king in the endgame. The rook captures on b5, opening the a file and preparing to attack black's potentially weak b2 pawn. This move recaptures the pawn, entering an endgame where white has a slight material advantage and better pawn structure, requiring black to defend precisely. This rook lift is a strong positional move, repositioning the rook to a more active square to support the pawn on e4 and potentially attack the d4 pawn, while also preparing to contest the open file on the d file. The rook now occupies the open e file, challenging black's control and preparing to potentially advance or support a kingside initiative. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside by using the a pawn to advance and potentially support its promotion, while also preparing to defend the e4 pawn. The king now moves to a safer square, unpinning the rook from the f file and preparing to contest the open b file. This rook maneuver aims to activate the rook on the open file, exert pressure along the second rank, and potentially support a pawn advance or prepare for further exchanges. This move activates the rook on the 7th rank, preparing to contest the d file and potentially create a passed pawn by supporting the advance of the b pawn. The pawn advance to a5 aims to restrict black's rook on e7 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, while also preparing to support the rook on the b file. This move redirects the bishop to a safer square, potentially preparing to challenge white's active rook on the 7th rank or reinforce the kingside if the opportunity arises. This rook maneuver aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside advance or preparing to challenge white's passed pawn on the d file. The rook is activated to the 7th rank, preparing to attack white's weak a pawn and potentially establish an outpost on the d7 square if white's rook retreats. The rook on a1 now supports the advancing a pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn or force concessions from black's slightly passive pieces. Black centralizes the rook to support the potential advance of the a-pawn and prepare for further king-side activity. The pawn push g4 aims to create defensive space for the king and potentially prepare a kingside pawn storm to harass black's pieces. The move 39, kf6 aims to activate the king, bringing it closer to the center and potential action on the kingside, while also freeing the rook for potential defensive or offensive maneuvers. With the king now safely on the g2 square, white prepares to activate the rook on the kingside, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create attacking chances. The move aims to centralize the king, preparing to contest the open d-file and support potential pawn advances, while also improving its safety behind the pawns. The move re1+ forces the black king to move, aiming to exploit the king's position and potentially open up lines for white's rooks to further attack. This move correctly develops the king to a safer square, avoiding the open files and potential checks along the e-file, while preparing to support the central pawns. This move leverages the open c-file to force the black king to a more vulnerable position, setting up further pressure along the rank. 42. kc6 is a necessary defensive maneuver to protect the king from the immediate check and to keep the rook on the 7th rank, which is crucial for contesting the open file. This move activates the rook to a crucial open file, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's king and potentially create threats against the f7 pawn. This move is a defensive reaction to white's passed pawn, aiming to exchange material and simplify into a more manageable endgame, although it concedes the a-file and allows white to consolidate. This move aims to exploit the unprotected pawn on h7, initiating a decisive kingside attack that should lead to the capture of more material or a checkmate threat. This move seeks to regain material advantage by forcing white to defend the king, potentially leading to a discovered attack or a queen exchange that favors black in the endgame. The king now seeks safety on the kingside while preparing to potentially support the pawn on h7 and centralize later. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square where it can exert pressure on white's queenside pawn structure and potentially target squares like f3. This pawn push aims to create a defensive pawn chain on the kingside, offering the king some breathing room and potentially preparing to advance the pawns further to gain space and restrict the opponent's bishop. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by forcing an exchange of the rook and opening lines for the king, but it's unlikely to succeed given white's superior pawn structure and king safety. The king's defensive maneuver to g2 is a prudent retreat, offering a safe square away from the advancing black rook and its support, preparing for potential defensive operations. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, creating threats along the a2-8 diagonal and potentially supporting advances on the kingside. This move aims to consolidate white's material advantage by attacking the f4 pawn, which is currently defended only by black's king and a knight, while simultaneously creating mating threats along the first rank. This pawn push aims to create a protected passed pawn on the kingside, but it weakens the king's position by opening lines and allows black to activate their rook. This pawn capture opens the g-file, aiming to create a passed pawn on h7 while activating the rook and potentially exploiting white's king. The capture of the bishop on g5 is a necessary trade to simplify the position, as the doubled pawns on the kingside after the bishop's recapture would be a significant weakness. This move initiates an attempt to exploit white's material advantage by simplifying the position and activating the rook to attack black's weakened kingside pawn structure. This move aims to activate the rook along the open file and support the advance of the g-pawn, putting pressure on white's kingside pawn structure. This move activates the rook to a more active file, preparing to support the advance of the g-pawn and potentially create mating threats on the kingside. This move aims to centralize the bishop and prepare for potential exchanges or to offer support for pawn pushes on the kingside, while also keeping an eye on the vulnerable d4 square. The king actively re-enters the game, seeking safety and preparing to support the pawn structure from the side. The bishop retreats to d4 to protect the pawn on g6 and to potentially support a kingside pawn. Advance later if black can organize a defense. This move centralizes the king, aiming to support the pawn on f4 and potentially join the attack on black's kingside, while also preparing to contest the open files. The bishop repositions to b2, eyeing the weakened pawn structure on white's queenside and preparing to support potential breakthroughs or exchanges. This pawn push aims to create a passed pawn by either pushing further or sacrificing itself for pawn removal, potentially creating dynamic attacking chances. This move is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by forcing the white king into a more active position and potentially opening lines for the black rooks. The king's pawn advances to f5, aiming to create a passed pawn and potentially activate the king in the endgame. The black king, having been forced into the center, is now being actively attacked, and this check is a desperate attempt to gain tempo and escape further scrutiny. This move aims to consolidate the advantage by bringing the king to a more active central position, potentially preparing to support a pawn push or to join the attack on the queenside. The move 56, re1 advances the rook to the first rank, creating an immediate threat against the white king and attempting to disrupt white's mating attack. This rook move reactivates the rook to a more central file, preparing to support the pawn push or to participate in potential kingside action by swinging over. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the open files and potentially harass white's king if the pawns advance further. This move initiates an attack on the pawn at e4, aiming to disrupt black's king safety and potentially create weaknesses in the pawn structure. The move 58, b5 repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing potential squares on the kingside and creating a defensive screen for the black king while preparing to support a pawn advance. This move 59, rh6 initiates a mating attack by bringing the rook into the action on the kingside, aiming to exploit black's exposed king and potentially create threats along the h-file or via a rook lift. This move aims to regroup the black king away from the dangerous open file and white's attacking pieces, preparing to defend the weak kingside pawn structure. This move repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create new attacking chances on the kingside. This move is an attempt to exploit the exposed king by forcing it towards the a3 square, potentially creating tactical opportunities or drawing the king out to a more vulnerable position. The king's critical journey across the board to h5 now allows black's rook to deliver a check, forcing white's king to a less active square and potentially losing material. The bishop repositions to d4, aiming to reinforce the kingside defense while keeping an eye on potential pawn advances by white, particularly the g-pawn. This rook lift aims to bring the rook into a more active position on the kingside, potentially targeting black's king or supporting a pawn push, while also creating defensive threats against black's potential counterplay. This move brings the bishop back to a more active diagonal, threatening the pawn on g5 and maintaining pressure on white's kingside while also preparing to support the rook's advance. This check forces black's king into a more vulnerable position, aiming to exploit the open file and potentially prepare for a mating attack or material gain. This move aims to reposition the king to safety and prepare for further defensive or offensive maneuvers, as the opponent's rook on h7 poses a potential threat to the king's safety. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's potentially weak kingside pawns and prepare for further infiltration into black's position. This move activates the rook on the open f-file, forcing the white king to move and preventing white from consolidating their material advantage. The king's move to e6 aims to centralize the monarch, preparing to escort the g-pawn forward while maintaining an active defensive posture against black's rook. This move continues the defense, aiming to consolidate the position and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside to create counterplay. This move creates a passed pawn on the g-file by advancing the pawn to g6, aiming to support it with the king and potentially the bishop for a decisive advance.